Hello, creative, and welcome back to the Empowered Creatives podcast, finding confidence between hustle and burnout. I'm your host, Victoria Hines, creative career coach, helping creatives just like you navigate those twists and turns in your creative career. So a few weeks ago, I was watching a documentary that actually came out a few years ago on Netflix called Blood, Sex, and Royalty. And this was a very dramatized documentary, 3-part, about Anne Boleyn. And for those of you who don't know Anne Boleyn was one of the wives, the second wife of Henry VIII. And she was Queen of England for about 3 years before she was beheaded. Now, what I found really fascinating was, although this was a very dramatized version of her story, there were also all these incredible female historians that they pulled in and interviewed to really try to deep dive into the psychology of what happened based on the evidence, who she was, why she might have made the decisions she did, and really kind of flesh out her character as not just a wife, not just someone who convinced Henry to leave the Vatican, not just the mother of Elizabeth I, who became this incredible long-running queen, and not just the queen who was first beheaded, but rather this complex woman who had a story, a history, a life, achievements, a fascinating background, and got caught up in the power and politics of all of these other men. So as I watch this series, and I promise I have a point, I really flash back also to when I got to see Six, the musical, which if you haven't seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend. I will drop the link to the musical so you can listen in the show notes below. But this musical is a 90-minute rock concert rendition of the 6 women who were wives to King Henry VIII, taking back their stories and really just having a really wonderful time about it. And as I kind of was watching this documentary and reminiscing on that musical, I had all of these sort of really big lessons popping back out at me, and all of these wonderful things that are sort of those, yeah, of course, but these wonderful lessons that I think we can learn from each of these women. And so this episode, I'm actually going to share 6 lessons that you can take into your career as learned from the 6 queens of Henry VIII. Hey there, creative. I have a delightful invitation just for you. Imagine diving even deeper into the incredible world of living your life as an empowered creative, including more tips, tricks, and advice arriving straight into your inbox. Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, guess what? I've got something special brewing, and I don't want you to miss out. Introducing my oh-so-awesome bi-weekly email newsletter. It's a vibrant community bursting with passion, curiosity, and the love of building a creative life. By joining my newsletter, you'll get first access to new promotions and launches, as well as my welcoming voice in your ear every other week. Also, I'll share with you my creative career audit worksheet, a secret tool myself and clients have used during our own career transitions and pivots. So don't miss this opportunity to be my pen pal, as well as deepen your connection with fellow empowered creatives by heading to www.victoriahines.com or following the link in the show notes below. Thank you for being such an incredible listener, and I really look forward to sharing this exciting journey with you through both the podcast and my newsletter. Now, let's dive back into the show. So, like I said, this one's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to give you a little bit of context on who these women were, followed by a lesson, and we'll dive into that. All right, so first up, we have Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon was the first wife of King Henry VIII. She was actually married to his brother before his brother died, and subsequently was then married to Henry. She was very, very religious, very devout, very strong, very resilient. She ended up giving Henry Mary. So he had a daughter through that marriage, and they were married for 24 years. Now, Henry, for context, was very much obsessed with having a male heir. He had all these people around him who were telling him, you really need a male heir. You need somebody who's a man who can take over the throne when you're gone. This was a very new succession to the throne, so there was just a lot of fear there. And Catherine, unfortunately, had had children die in the past. She had had miscarriages, and at this point, she was probably not going to be giving him what he wanted. Which flashback to human giver syndrome, where she's stuck in this position where she has to be nice, be kind, and she exists to serve someone else. Unfortunately, the context of the time. She was also the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. So she came from power. She understood royalty. She understood the politics behind it. And she was a mighty force. So Henry, via his second wife, Anne Boleyn, which I'll dive into in a second, decides he wants to get a divorce from Catherine. He wants a divorce. He wants the marriage to be deemed annulled through a lot of just, kind of like finagling the situation and just say, hey, under the eyes of God, we were not actually married. And Catherine refuses, foot in sand, refuses to have the marriage annulled. She will not do it. Because in her eyes, she spent 24 years with this man and bared him a child and was the Queen of England. And she refuses to acknowledge the fact that she did anything wrong. Because in all reality, she didn't. They were kind of just manipulating the situation. So the lesson I think we can take into our careers and our businesses from Catherine of Aragon is stay true to you. It's so important to understand your personal values and beliefs and pull those into your business. So one of the first exercises I did myself when I launched my business was figuring out what are my morals, what are my values that I have to have in my business. And for me, that's honesty and compassion. Those are two things that are so deeply important to me. And if I don't follow those in my business, if I don't follow those in my career, if I end up having to work with people who don't understand how much I value those, then things are going to go wrong very, very quickly. So I highly recommend dive in, do a little exercise, figure out what your values are, write it down, and stay true to them. You will probably find if you are in a job where maybe you work for somebody else, if that job asks you to compromise on those values that you have, like trust or integrity or honesty, compassion, those standard, just overarching values, you're probably going to have a lot of issues. And it's going to be very hard to fix it. So our lesson today from Catherine of Aragon is stay true to you. Stay devout to your values. All right, the second wife. Second wife is Anne Boleyn. So the one who kicked off, inspired this entire episode. So Anne Boleyn's a ton of fun. She was very well educated, witty, confident, and super ambitious. She was very charismatic and a very skilled conversationalist. She came from a pretty affluent family that wasn't super high up the totem pole, but was still very well respected. And she spent many years actually refusing Henry, to be perfectly frank. It sounds like from history or from the facts, like she didn't necessarily jump in full force and was like, great, I'm going to take Henry VIII as my husband, steal him away from Catherine of Aragon, which I think many dramatized versions of that story put that as the storyline. So it seems like Henry just became very infatuated with her. And she did not want to be his mistress. She sort of refused. And she kind of gave him an ultimatum of, hey, you either marry me, get an annulment, or this is not happening between us. Which I can respect. I can respect that. So she had a lot of beliefs. She was reading a lot of books, and she had a lot of, I would say, fringe beliefs at that time, is what I've come to learn. And ultimately, in order to help with said divorce and annulment, she convinces Henry that he should be above the Pope, above the Vatican, and he should actually break away and eventually form his own Church of England. So that's exactly what happens. Henry wants this annulment. He gets it. He ends up marrying Anne Boleyn and forms the Church of England. And she is she's very much behind England moving more towards a Protestant religion. She's also the mother of Elizabeth I. So she really wanted to give Henry a male heir. It didn't actually happen. But I will go to say Elizabeth I ends up becoming one of the longest reigning queens who never marries. And back in that time, that is crazy. Love Elizabeth I. And the fact that Anne is her mother, I think is just, it's wonderful. So what happens? So she doesn't give Henry a male heir. And suddenly she starts losing her power and control in the court. And suddenly all of these little figures, all of these little men on the fringes decide to pull away and put their eggs in different baskets and convince Henry that he doesn't need her. So I'm not going to go into the details, but ultimately Henry decides he doesn't want her around anymore, doesn't want her in his life. He wants to move on to the next woman who can hopefully give him a male heir. And so this entire evidence, quote unquote, appears that she was having affairs. And so she ends up getting put into the Tower of London, or she goes on trial and is ultimately deemed that she is guilty, and she is beheaded. So leading up to that moment where she's losing power, she's losing control, she was actually lashing out a lot. She started pushing away friends, confidants, people that she was close to. And a lot of these individuals started turning on her as well. So she ended up in a very, very scary place where she had next to nobody she could trust. Maybe a few individuals, but very, very few people that she could turn to, confide in, and trust. And so the lesson that I think we all can learn from Anne Boleyn is when things get tough, when you go through hard times, bring your network of support closer to you. Lashing out, getting angry, pushing people away because you don't want them to see you as weak is not going to help you in your career or business for the long run. Vulnerability is actually a really great thing, and it can help you find the resources, the tools, the support you need to get through these very, very tough times. So that's the second lesson, is when things are hard, bring in the people you know, you love, you trust, that you need. Bring them in closer to you. Confide in them. All right, the third wife. The third wife is Jane Seymour. So Jane was actually a lady in waiting to both Catherine of Aragon as well as Anne Boleyn. She was not much is actually known about her because there's not as much documented about Jane Seymour. But we do know she was kind of described as reserved. She was gentle, she was virtuous, she was compassionate. It's a little bit of the epitome of a human giver syndrome. I like to think there was more to her than that. But I'm sure she was a wonderful, wonderful, lovely woman. She did end up giving birth to Henry VIII's first male heir, Edward VI. And unfortunately, she died right after childbirth. That was the end of her life. So, with her very small short story, not much known about her, the lesson I think we can all learn from her is that you are worth more than what you produce. You are worth more than what you produce. This is something that's been incredibly hard for women, but I think it's also incredibly hard for creatives, because oftentimes we feel like the output of what we do is all that matters. And it's hard to remember that the product isn't always the most important part. It's not just the product that matters. So that's our lesson from Jane Seymour. Our fourth lesson is from Anne of Cleves. So Anne of Cleves was the fourth wife of Henry VIII. He married her right after Jane. And Anne of Cleves was actually German. And Henry chose to marry her based on a portrait that was painted of her and sent to him. And he looked at the portrait and was like, yep, I'll marry that woman. Now, unfortunately, what happened is she showed up and Henry suddenly decided, I don't think she looks like her photograph. I'm not that attracted to her. Don't really want to be married to her. Very disappointed in her looks. So they were married, but they had a very amicable divorce. So she is the one queen who got a pretty easy divorce. She received a huge substantial income. She got several estates to go live at. She received a title. It was called the King's Sister, which is slightly weird because she was married to him, but who knows how that worked in those days. And she got out of that relationship pretty unscathed and doing pretty well. So I think the lesson that we can learn from Anne of Cleves is set clear expectations up front. Clear is kind. I learned those words from Brené Brown, and I think they are so true. In your business, in your career, it is so easy to have miscommunication, crossed wires, and not understand the scope of work, which leads to all sorts of disgruntlement, to feeling lost, to feeling overwhelmed, to having work balloon on you, leads to all sorts of problems. You can make a concerted effort, even if you're not a manager, from the bottom up. You can work to make sure you have clear expectations set. Ask for them. So I love one of Brené Brown's terms. She says, paint done for me, which actually is kind of ironic given that Anne of Cleves her portrait was painted. All right, I'll take the irony away. But when you say paint done for me, you're basically asking somebody who's giving you a project, what does the finished product look like? What are you actually after right now? What's the goal? What's the expectation? So that you can figure out if you can meet it or if you need to realign on expectations. Super valuable in your career. The fifth wife, Catherine Howard. So Catherine Howard was described, she's thought to be vivacious, she's youthful, she's charming. She's very youthful. She's about half the age of Henry VIII when she ends up getting married to him. Not quite sure based on her birth certificate how old she was, but anywhere from 19 to 20, and he was 40. So she has this very engaging personality. He was probably very bespoken by her, just found her fascinating, charming, loving, decides to get married to her. Now, what comes out is, after he's married to her, is that there are all of these premarital and extramarital affairs. Now, in our day and age, premarital affairs really should not matter, but in that day and age, they did. And all of these affairs come out into the open, and it leads to her also being beheaded and executed only 2 years into their marriage. So there's a lot of evidence that points to these relationships were not consensual. She was probably taken advantage of in a few of them. And that would have been really difficult and not something she could have openly talked about with anybody to really work through those issues. So Catherine Howard is a woman who had very little agency over her relationships. And as a result, she ended up losing her life because of it. Now, your career hopefully does not have those same circumstances on it, but I think the lesson we can learn from Catherine is to take agency in your career. All of us should be taking an active role in shaping our career path. The more you sit back and are complacent or don't lean in or don't hop in or don't take an active role in where your career is going, the more you can end up going in a direction that you don't want to be headed. It's important for all of us to make intentional decisions. Take actions that align with our goals and values, and also advocate for ourselves, both in the workplace as well as when we are building a business. On the business side, imagine saying yes to everything a client wanted you to do. You're going to find yourself quickly exhausted. So you're going to find more success in the long run in your career if you really step into your own agency and guide your career and our business forward. All right, the sixth wife, here's a fun one, Catherine Parr. So Catherine Parr survived. First and foremost, she outlived Henry. So she's the only one. She is also thought to have reconciled Henry's relationship with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, which is quite incredible. She was a pretty big force in mostly Elizabeth and Edward VI, Jane Seymour's son, both of their lives. Mary was a little bit older, so wasn't quite as bespoken by her. Mary, I think, was also the same age as Catherine Parr, so lots of issues there. But Catherine Parr was known to be kind, personable, and smart. She was also a very extensive writer. She was very into religious and theological topics, which to each their own. But that's what she was into. And she was very prolific in that writing. She even wrote and published a book, which I think is pretty freaking cool for a woman of that age. And another thing is she actually served as the regent twice when Henry was away, which really proved that she had a ton of leadership skills. The little tidbit that I think I love the most about her life and what we can glean from it is she was a very big influence in Elizabeth I's life. She helped educate her. And because Elizabeth I is the one who is eventually going to take over the English throne and reign over England for years and never get married and do it solo, I like to think that Catherine was such a pivotal force in Elizabeth's life. And so the lesson I think I want to take away and I want to share with you from Catherine Parr is the actions you take in your career or business pave the way for someone to follow. There are going to be hard moments. There are going to be tough decisions. There are going to be vulnerable moments where you might have to step up for an injustice, or you might have to have tough conversations, where you might have to move the needle. And I'll just be frank, for people of color and women in business as well as the workforce, historically, it has not been easy. And if you're a woman of color, that's even harder. But every time you step into a position of leadership, every time you show somebody else that this is possible, every time you do something that nobody's seen before, every time you make a small change, a small difference, sometimes you're not going to feel the impact. It's not going to be an immediate reward for you. But that small shift can help someone who looks just like you follow in your footsteps, follow behind you. So I love that saying that rising tides lift all boats. And I think the same phrase works well here as well. Is when you help raise the water just a little bit, you help raise up the boat for other people following in your footsteps. All right, so just a recap of all of the lessons. From Catherine of Aragon, we learned to stay true to you. From Anne Boleyn, we learned when you go through hard times, find your network of support and keep them close. From Jane Seymour, we learned that you're worth more than what you produce. From Anne of Cleves, we learned to set clear expectations up front. From Catherine Howard, we learned to take agency in our career. And from Catherine Parr, we learned that actions that you take in your career or business pave the path for someone to follow. So here's your one thing this week. Which note of wisdom, which lesson did you need to hear today in order to advance your business or career? And remember that all of us, in some small way, are building off of the individuals who have done something extraordinary before us. What's the small lesson you need to learn today? Go ahead and write that down. All right, creative, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe. I'd also be super curious what you thought about this episode. It's a little bit of a leap from my normal content that I put out. So any thoughts or feedback you have for me, you can either sign up for my newsletter, and if you reply to any of those, you can send me an email, or send me a little note on Instagram. The link's in the bio below, or in the show notes below. And with that being said, until the next time, stay creative.